Principle of rhythm. Quote, "The principles of truth are 7. One who knows these, understandingly, possesses the magic key before whose touch all the doors of the temple fly open." The Kybalion. The 7 Hermetic principles, upon which Hermetic philosophy is based, are as follows. 1. The principle of mentalism. 2. The principle of correspondence. 3. The principle of vibration. 4. The principle of polarity. 5. The principle of rhythm. 6. The principle of cause and effect. 7. The principle of gender. Taking then the 5th, the principle of rhythm, which states that, quote, "Everything flows, out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall, the pendulum swing manifests in everything, the measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left, rhythm compensates." The Kybalion. This principle embodies the truth that in everything there is manifest a measured motion, to and fro. An outflow and an inflow. A swing backward and a swing forward. A pendulum-like movement. A tide-like ebb and flow. A high tide and a low tide. Between the two poles which exist in accordance with the principle of polarity. By the principle of rhythm is meant the swinging of things between opposites. A pendulum swings from one side and then to the opposite side. We can see the law at work in nature as in the change of seasons from winter to summer then back again, to and fro without ceasing. And in the movement of the tides, in the motion of the waves, up and down and so on. We also have many pendulums in ourselves, for what lies in the universe is in us too, for as above, so below. We can observe that we have rhythms flowing between like and dislike, between desire and disgust, between happiness and dejection, between love and hate, affirmation and negation, certainty and doubt, and so on. These pendulums have different periods, which is length of swing. And just like clocks, some go faster and some go slower, in the same time. That is, they swing faster or slower between opposites. There is also the cycle of our lives which swings between the opposite signs of birth and death. This is the period of life. We swing physically from birth to death, we do not however see the opposite swing. Many things are said in ancient literature about the opposites between which all things swing to and fro, as between the checking or limiting of forces. One must not assume when it is said that things swing to and fro, that this means there is no law governing their movement. It means that there are checking forces at work. It is said in the book of Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, quote, "All things are double, one against another." See chapter 42, verse 24. Let's then take this phrase and ask, what does it mean that a thing is double? It means that to everything there is an opposite through which it exists, and by which it is opposed. It's farua in the French language, or farvashi, as termed in ancient Persia. As a rough example, darkness implies light as its opposite, and light darkness, then together they make one, a duality that we might call light-dark, one thing when divided becomes light or dark. Or, to take a psychological example, sorrow and joy are opposites. They are one against the other, and together are a thing which is double, that we might call joy-sorrow. Notice also that sorrow destroys joy, and joy sorrow. They are opposites and so mutually destructive. Take once more hunger and satiety, which are also opposite states. As hunger is appeased by eating, the opposite, namely satiety, or even disgust, appears. Then the swing of the pendulum into satiety is followed by its swing back to hunger. What we must see is that hunger and satiety, although so contrary, form one and the same thing, which we can call hunger-satiety, and they are inseparable, although one is against the other. In other words, we cannot have one without the other, any more than one could have a stick with only one end. In this regard, compare the remarks of Ecclesiasticus, quote, "All things are double, one against another," with an observation made by Philo in the 1st century AD. Philo, who was associated with a school in Alexandria, says, "That which is made up of both the opposites is one, and when this one is dissected the opposites appear." This is an interesting view of life if one cares to reflect upon it. Another ancient reference to opposites can be taken from that strange piece of esoteric literature found in the 2nd book of Esdras, from the 3rd chapter onwards, in the apocryphal Old Testament. "The woods of the trees of the field went forth, and took counsel together, then said, Come, let us go and make war against the sea, that it may depart away before us, and that we might make us more woods. The waves of the sea also in like manner took counsel together, and said, Come, let us go up and subdue the wood of the plain, that there also we might make us another country. The counsel of the wood was in vain, for the fire came and consumed it, likewise also the counsel of the waves of the sea, for the sand stood up and stopped them. See the second book of Esdras, chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. In this passage the idea is expressed that everything is kept balanced by means of the law of opposites. One thing checks another. That which checks or destroys another thing can be thought of as its opposite. The wood thinks it will dominate the world, but the fire consumes it. The sea thinks it will overrun the plains, but the sand checks it. The unknown writer of Esdras is using physical imagery to represent forces that act in nature, that keep everything between certain limits, thus preventing any one thing from getting the upper hand permanently. We can reflect endlessly on illustrations showing one thing checking another. Think for a moment how every living creature is attacked and eaten by some other creature, so that a balance is maintained. This balance is a result of the work of opposites. The law of the pendulum indicates that there is a swing to, and a swing fro in all things, however after a point in either direction there is a check, and the opposite force begins to exert itself. We can see for ourselves that as a pendulum swings further and further, say to the right, it gets slower and slower, until its motion reverses and it swings to the left, which means that the opposites, if we term them right and left, alternately have power. Notice that when the pendulum is fully to the right is weakest and the left begins to have power, and vice versa. Sometimes you can see this expressed in psychological experience, as when an individual appears violently against something, taking an extreme attitude, then suddenly swings to the opposite viewpoint. Many of the phenomena of sudden conversion belong to this pendulum swing. There is the case of Paul, who persecuted the early Christian church with the utmost energy and hatred, then suddenly had an experience that turned him in the reverse direction. It must be said that it's not easy to understand the opposite forces and their work, which is always double and so requires dual thinking. We think in terms of one thing, comparing it with another thing. We do not think in terms of two things simultaneously. We think in terms of one force, then find it difficult to think in terms of two forces, and impossible to think in terms of three forces. Presently, however, we speak only of two forces, opposite in their nature, which govern or limit all things and prevent too much excess or deficiency. All phenomena, all visible things, all events, all earthly life take place between opposite forces, or opposite poles. Now swinging this way and now that, so that war follows peace and peace war, famine follows plenty and plenty famine, and so on. Herein lies the popularity of diagnosing bipolarism and its predominance in modern Freudian psychology. When we begin to realize this, we can understand that time is different on different occasions. On a small scale, we realize that if we have a good time today, we may have a bad time tomorrow. It is really the law of the pendulum, again expressed in Ecclesiastes. Quote, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away, a time to rend, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace." See the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. Notice that many opposites are mentioned throughout this passage, and that the meaning lies in one part of time as things go well, then in another when they go badly. Or in one part of time one plants, and in another part it is absurd to plant. Just imagine if one should always plant, and always be born, or always build up, always weep and so on. The passage quoted means that everything comes to an end, and then turns into its opposite over time. The last words are most important: everything comes to an end in time, so that one thing is replaced by its opposite. What do we mean by the end of a thing? Have you ever thought that the end of sorrow is joy, the end of weeping is laughter, The end in fact of everything we know in this life of time, lies is its opposite. What should we call the end of any war? We call it peace, which is its opposite. And what is the end of peace? Why, it is surely once more the resumption of war. What lies at the end of pain? Is it not that relief from pain for which we have no exact word? It is interesting to try to think of words that really express opposite states. When we catch a glimpse of the idea that all life lies between opposites, we begin to realize what controls events, and that all life is also controlled. We may even at this stage say that everything is the result of two opposing forces, yin and yang, which tend to counterbalance one another and so produce a balance in all things, which is the Tao. We find an example of this in the physiological workings of our body, where it seems as if health is the result of a balancing of opposite or antagonistic systems, chemical and otherwise. The Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived in the 5th century BC, taught that health was a harmony, a balance between different forces or elements, and illness the consequence of one or another becoming too strong. We might also think that psychological health is of a similar nature, the result of two or more factors in balance. In the sacred temple of Delphi, 2 inscriptions were written for those to read who entered to consult the oracle. One was composed of the famous words, "Know thyself." The other, less known, was, "Nothing too much." This does not mean too much in the sense that a person cannot do or give too much. The Greek language does not bear such a meaning. The phrase means, nothing in extremes. Notice the order of these two sayings. First, an individual must know themselves, and then they must not go to extremes. Once we know ourselves, then we comprehend what those extremes are in ourselves. To know what is in oneself takes many years of self-experience. Self-knowledge implies, among many other things, knowing the opposites in oneself, and becoming conscious of them. Then we can begin to understand and apply the second aphorism. Nothing too much. We can picture a tightrope walker who maintains their balance by swinging now to the right, and then to the left. Of course they already know how to do this through muscle memory, and study of themselves, for without knowledge they could not do it. Suppose we ask them Pontius Pilate's question, "What is truth?" and then say, "Is it to the right or to the left?" If they answered that it was both, then our sense of truth would be offended, because we all imagine that truth must be rigid and inflexible. It is said that once upon a time, someone dreamed they had discovered the secret of the universe, then woke up and wrote down their dream. Next morning they found they had simply written, "Walk on both legs." In the sphere of our own psychology, the place we live in with our consciousness, having no real self-knowledge, we walk as one disabled, on one leg, regarding truth as something invariable. We think we know what is right and wrong or good and bad, then because of this have no idea what it is to maintain balance in ourselves. We do not see the opposites inside of us, save in the sense of all that being bad, and this being good. It is said in this work that the devil is also necessary. We are swung about by the events of life, which is always changing its aspect, yet as we are swung we do not try to assimilate the opposites. We ignore everything that does not correspond to our viewpoints. What does not correspond to our viewpoints is, for us, the devil or darkness, and so we walk on one leg. However, we can understand that it would be a mistake for any tightrope walker to regard the left as the devil and the right only as desirable. For we would say that at different times they have to lean to the right or lean to the left, and that only in this way can they advance. This is the idea expressed in the passage from Ecclesiastes quoted, that there is a time to keep and a time to cast away. At one time a person should speak and at another they should keep silence. What does this mean? It means that if people are looking for a rigid code of truth, if they regard truth as a rigid series of fixed rules, then they will never find anything. Nothing is the same in time, because time is change. Everything changes in time. And everything in time changes between opposites. It is now one way and then the opposite way. Everything in time is governed by the opposites and swings between them. This is the significance of the passage quoted from Ecclesiastes. Things that will go well at one moment will not go well at the next. There is a time for everything under the sun and everything is excellent in its own time. People expect things always to be the same, and when things do not correspond to what they wish, they seem incapable of adjusting themselves and taking in impressions from that side of life that does not correspond to their viewpoints. There is nothing more difficult for us to learn than time is not the same. We want the same and expect the same, although of course we also complain about this. Our inability to assimilate the opposite, to see things from an adverse point of view, to be conscious on both sides of the pendulum, renders us liable to monotony. And this is deeply based upon our general attitude to life that does not include the idea of opposites. We insist on taking life in a one-sided way, then regard everything that is contrary to our viewpoints as exceptional or unfortunate. The result is a lack of flexibility, where we lean to the right and refuse to lean to the left when occasion demands it. Rob Kurzban of the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania explains this through self-promotion. The conscious self assists in a self-promotion effort. This modular view of the mind, which makes up what we refer to commonly as self, is a compound of the bits and pieces of ourselves. Conscious self is then implicated as largely being in the public relations business. Anthony G. Greenwald, in his paper on the totalitarian ego, fabrication and revision of personal history, uses the term benefactance, perception of responsibility for desired, but not undesirable outcomes. This word is made up of two parts: the beneficial that we like to present subjectively. We like to present ourselves as being beneficial to others. Then the reflective, as we like to project ourselves as being capable and competent. When it comes to a skill, most people will describe themselves as being above average, yet if you calculate the odds, then this outcome could not be possible. The way we naturally interpret negative outcomes is to explain these negative outcomes as being due to factors outside of or other than ourselves, being due to bad luck, or some other such external evidence beyond our control. We do not notice the bad luck that other people have either, only our own. When we are, for example, asked to assess how much we've contributed to some team effort, we do the same thing, claiming more credit for the outcome than is possible. Most people believe that they do more good things than the average, and fewer bad things. Therefore we generally believe that we are more morally upstanding than we actually are, which is selective retention. The way our memory filters out certain unfavorable things, retaining the more favorable. Martin van Linden writes in his paper Remembering Pride and Shame, Self-Enhancement and the Autobiographical Memory, that people's self-images are grounded in autobiographical memories. His study shows that the positive events of our lives are remembered in far greater detail than the negative events. Negative events are not reflected as well in the retelling as the positive ones are. Interestingly, however, regarding other people, it appears to work in the opposite manner. We remember mostly the negative things that they do and not so much of the positive. People are aware of these biases, however much more so in others. Emily Pronin, Daniel Y. Lin and Lee Ross suggest in their paper titled The Bias Blind Spot, Perceptions of Bias in Self versus Others, that individuals see the existence and operation of cognitive and motivational biases much more in others than in themselves. We lack an objective perception of ourselves and the things that happen to us. There are reasons for this inherent in natural selection, namely that a living thing exists in a state of balance. It is balanced between life and death, so as long as it makes a distinction between itself and what it lives in, it remains alive. We cannot be alive if we take up a fixed view of life, as the interaction between life and ourselves then ceases. We become identified with our view of life. The work teaches that we should never become identified with life, whichever way it is swinging, whether into war or peace, comfort or hardship and so on. However, we all want things to be unchanging. It's as if we wanted to freeze things into a fixed pattern. Then we become identified through our attitudes. The surface of life and the surface of ourselves cease to have their normal interchange. We then become life, and there is no longer any living in life. Every living organism is alive because it resists life, then learns through behavior how to use it. Hence from this angle life is the opposite to life. Every living thing is born into life wound up like a spring under tension. It is more than its surroundings. It has a certain energy that makes it more clever than the life in which it finds itself. It has a surface that meets the surface of life, and between these two surfaces that living thing lives. It lives by opposites, in the sense that life is an antagonist to it. As long as it can deal with life, then it is alive. However, in the case of humanity, who are more complex than other living creatures, we must understand that we have a psychological surface apart from a physical one. Our environment is not only a physical environment but also a psychological one. Have you ever asked yourself, what is your psychological environment? Have you a sense of surface towards it? Do we keep this side of ourselves alive with good interchange? Or are we nothing but our psychological environment, going with everyone's opinion, with everything we hear, with everything we read and see? In that case we really are zombies, because there is no distinction between ourselves and life. Unless you feel that you are living in life, you are dead, as there is no tension, no resistance between the two surfaces of life and yourself. The concept of entropy explains this, the idea being that everything tends to seek equilibrium. If you place a boiling kettle into a room, it will warm up the surroundings until everything is at the same temperature. Hence, once life and death resonate, as it were, at the same frequency, then you are dead. We can only work if we have a higher vibration than life, and we have in us ways of keeping ourselves more vibrant than life. This sense of surface tension, whether intellectual, emotional or physical, that separates us from the surface of external life is necessary. It is really another aspect of self-remembering. All things have an outline or surface that distinguishes them from life. We are all different shapes, animals, insects, plants, minerals, and so on. Yet every one of us has a particular shape that distinguishes us from what we live in. We meet at our surfaces, the surface of life. Life seeks to devour us and we seek to devour life. Every living creature having the life given to it is capable of devouring external life, according to its own design. We are then not simply a physical shape, but also a psychological profile, a mental shape and an emotional shape. Because out of all creation humanity has a psychological destiny, apart from its physical destiny. The point essential to any teaching of the opposites is to realize that we live on this planet between opposites. Our whole lives ordinarily are governed by the law of the pendulum. We all swing to and fro. When you are in one opposite you are unconscious of the other, and vice versa. We may entertain the idle fantasy of rising and rising, of progressing and progressing, getting better and better, however all these are speculative imagination. One cannot escape from the opposites unless you know how to do so. You have to see both sides of yourself and how one side helps the other side, which requires dual thinking, it requires double consciousness, an objective consciousness, in other words it requires self-knowledge. What do you think self-knowledge means? It means knowledge of all sides of yourself. What do you think self-consciousness means? It means being conscious of all sides of yourself. First know thyself, then nothing in excess. What does excess mean? It means going too far to the right or too far to the left. It means not only this, but when we are too far to the right we are in excess and must therefore go to the left. Nothing is more painful than excessive goodness. Take people for instance who are excessively kind. Does it not immediately arouse the opposite in yourself, just as people who are excessively cruel? Naturally, all forms of vanity and pride, which form our false personality, enable us to think that we can do only good, and that we should be regarded with admiration. However, this is the delusion of self. Finding one's balance has nothing to do with pride or vanity. In the Sermon on the Mount, where it is said by Jesus that, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," we have to consider that vanity and pride place us in the opposites, and that to be poor in spirit means not to identify with oneself, not to be deluded by these perceptions we all have of a self, which is ego. We only identify with what we think is the best side of ourselves, so are rarely poor in spirit and so able to walk on two legs. We can only assimilate both sides of ourselves, both opposites in ourselves, and in others, in life, when we rid ourselves of the delusion of control, and this self of ours that we imagine persists through time. We're more comfortable with the same actor being present when we were 12 as presides today 30 years later. When people say, "Thank God I am not as other people are," do you consider them as one-sided? They have buffers established which blind them to their contradictions. If you are able to see both sides of yourself, what you call your good side and also your bad, then you begin to be conscious in opposites at the same time. This is where self-knowledge is allegorized in esoteric literature through a Sufi saying that, all true life is the peace and harmony of contraries. Death is due to war between them.